We're going to be discussing Europe, the world, the Green Deal, the state of democracy, geopolitics, all of that and more in the next hour. And I'm really looking forward to it. But before we get going, I'm going to hand over to Olaf Scholz, who's patron of the Progressive Governance Digital Summit.
Welcome to anybody and to everybody. I'm absolutely happy that we are joining together and discussing today about the pressing issues on progressive policies we are facing today. The most important question which we are dealing with at this time is the coronavirus and all the aspects of it. And we learn that this will have a lot of consequences for our society, and we can also learn something for the principles of the future developments of our society. So I think we need something like a progressive idea on what to do in the world we are now in and on the future. I think the crisis demonstrates clearly that solidarity is a necessary principle for organizing our lives. All those liberal ideas in some ways saying that anyone is living on its own feet and needs no cooperation with others did not well very good, neither on the individual level nor on the level of states, saying that we will make it as a nation without the support and cooperation with others. So my view on this question is that one of the outcomes of the crisis is that the need for solidarity is something which is necessary for mankind, for nations and for the world, and also for the European Union. And one of the aspects which is very fundamental in the debate we have today is that a lot of people learned that it is necessary to support those who are doing a very important job in our society, but are low paid, for instance. You can have a very comfortable life, but you will still be supported by a lot of people working in the shops, in the hospitals, in the factories, and which are absolutely necessary and doing key jobs for the future of the society and for the life we have. But this is something which should be not just something we know now in the crisis situation. This should be something which should have a consequence for the future. Not only, but especially paying them better as they are paid today, but also guaranteeing that we will have a social welfare state that is able to deal with the challenges we have. Those countries that have a very proper social welfare state and a very good health system make it better during the crisis. Anyone can see this. And all those that said before that it is not necessary and that we could reduce the investments into the social welfare systems learn today that this is not true, because you see the difference if you look at the different nations and how they deal with the crisis. My view is that we also should understand that one of the important outcomes of the crisis for us in Europe is that we work for a better union. When we now discuss about big programs which will make it feasible for us that we are supporting each other, this is something which could not be just these programs. So it was very good that we decided on a 540 billion package on support for small and medium-sized companies all over Europe with the EIB, on supporting short-term allowance schemes all over Europe with the SURE program of the European Union, and with giving access to the European Stability Mechanism for any state needing financial support within the Euro system. And that we are doing right to continue with an extra 500 billion package, which is now proposed by Germany and France, which gives the idea that those states that are hit most by the crisis need the support of all the others. We could not stick to that. So my point of view is that this must be the basis for a Hamiltonian moment in a way. Having common debts, which will be one of the outcomes of the crisis, means that we have to do and to something for more progress. We need common decisions with majority votes, for instance, the Council of the Finance Ministers, the ECOFIN, or in the Foreign Ministers' Council. We need something like minimum taxation, which makes it clear that we cannot just have support from one country to the other, but that there should be no arbitrage in taxing systems which is absolutely key for the future. And we should, for instance, work on own resources, which could be on European questions, for instance, emission trade developed for airlines and for seafaring, for instance. So there's a lot of questions that are on the table, which could make it more easy for us to have a better and a more sovereign European Union. And this will be a key question also for progressive policies in Europe. If we discuss about the situation, of the world, I think two questions will be also important dealing with the future, and they must be part of our discussion as I think. One is that we are tackling man-made climate change, and it is a very big task to be successful with the aim of having a zero neutral economy in 2050. This is just a very short time up to then. And if we want to do so, we must change all the ways of economic production we have today, and we must change all the ways we used during 250 years of industrialization. And if we want to continue to be wealthy countries with good jobs and good paid jobs, it is absolutely necessary that we are successful with this big task. And this is the same with digitalization, which I think could be not just something that is done by big companies from California, for instance. It must be something which is also a European project, just to give two ideas which might be important for the future. So in the end, I'm very happy to discuss with all those who are now in this debate, and I think we will have a good hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olaf. And obviously everybody in Germany knows who you are, but we're being watched from all around the world. So I should say that Olaf Scholz is the Federal Minister of Finance and Vice-Chancellor of Germany, and previously he served as the first mayor of Hamburg. So Olaf, that's very interesting. And let me take some of those themes as I move over to Annalena Baerbock, who's a German politician who currently serves as the chair of Alliance 90-the Greens, and is in the Bundestag. Annalena, I'm interested in what do you think has been changed by the coronavirus? I mean, there's been a lot of talk of how a crisis like this leads to change. And as Olaf has just described, there has genuinely been significant change in the European Union, this Hamilton moment that we've been hearing about. But more broadly, Annalena, what do you see as being changed by our experience of the pandemic?
Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, I would say that the positive thing really now at this moment that we all have learned that we can only face these kind of challenges if we stand united as a European Union. But it has taken some weeks, and in the beginning it was the opposite, which showed us again that the EU project is very fragile, because in the first moment of the pandemic, everybody, unfortunately also from the German government, thought for themselves and not as the European approach. But it gives us really a chance now to face the challenges of saying we as Europeans, we have to learn to find our own sovereignty. And this goes then to different things like, as Olaf has said, that the health system is a question of security. And if we care for our own security, like every nation provides like an army, just in case there would be any need for defending ourselves. And we don't ask if we really finance the army, because it's a question of prevention. Now we have the chance of rethinking what are the critical points for a society where we really have to look at prevention methods and investing into a healthcare system which stands by itself. It's really, really important. And I think the second point, which really could bring us forward if we take the chance at the moment, is also for progressive parties and progressive society to see change as the foundation for foothold, meaning that this is really the time where we can do the transformation we need. And I think it's not good looking only in the past, also the Hamilton moment, because we have to form the future, and giving stability for this transformation process is something which is really important. So if we take now billions of euros in our hands, we have to use them for a transformative way, but giving at the same time trust for the people that we care for them. And this is a big chance of transforming Europe really into a social, ecological unity, and then playing a role in the world where we are not depending on third parties so much anymore, as the pandemic has shown us we are in certain aspects at the day.
Thank you for that, Annalena. And can I ask you, while you're speaking, how has the developments in the European Union, how has that gone down in Germany? Because in the past, it has seemed that it has often been German public opinion which has been most resistant to these kinds of pooling mechanisms. It would just be interesting for me, from a British perspective and people watching from around the world, how has that been received by by the German public?
Positive. And I mean, we hear from different parties, also from government. Olaf is from the government, obviously, and I'm from the opposition party. And I would say it has taken too long that German government has really taken this chance. We could have done that already in the last crisis when we had the Euro crisis. And after this crisis, everybody said, okay, we should never face such a crisis anymore. Europe and the EU has to stand together, and also there we had the debate about Euro bonds, and unfortunately we didn't learn enough, obviously. And now, luckily, this time, I would say at the last moment, everybody took its guts together and took now the steps of this big European package. And it shows for me again that leadership, true leadership, also true European leadership, is always a question of courage. The times where people were saying, and also governments, also the German government, well, we cannot talk about common debts in Europe because the public opinion is not ready for it. I mean, then you don't give hold to people. Then you just, you're like swimming around. But at the moment, when leadership says, we believe it's really the best way to go, public opinion also came the same track. And on the other hand, it was such a big debate, also before the decision was taken, that actually the public called for this step. And I think the whole narrative of saying, well, currently the public opinion is not so pro-European, this is not really true. It really depends on an open European debate, and we can see those days that people were actually celebrating when the borders were reopened again. I come from Brandenburg, which is a state around Berlin, and it's at the border to Poland. And I was on the bridge between Frankfurt-Oder, which is one German city, and Słubice on the other side. And I celebrated in 2004 when the border was opened. And we had over years a debate, well, there are criminals around the border and so on and so on. A couple of days ago, when the border opened again between Poland and Germany, people from both sides were celebrating and were saying this is a moment like '89 and 2004, because this is our city over the Oder, over the old war bridge. And I think this we underestimate totally, that it's such in our daily life, the common European Union project, that in the future we shouldn't be so afraid anymore about public opinion.
Well, that's a wonderful and encouraging image. Of course, I have to say, in all of these conversations, I'm British, I didn't vote for Brexit, and so part of me just wants to weep when I hear about the progress the European Union is making, but I'm not going to wallow in my private grief. But it might be shared to a certain extent by our next speaker, Mariana Mazzucato, who is currently serves as Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London. But more important than that, Mariana is probably, I would say, one of the most influential public thinkers in the world. So Mariana, it looks like the European Union has been reading your work. It's working together, it's innovating, and a lot of the money that it's going to spend will also be oriented around the Green Deal. So do you feel the European Union is really taking the lead in the direction that it should be?
First, I think it's important to remember that Europe as a region is extremely diverse. It's very heterogeneous, not just in terms of culture, but also in terms of competitiveness. And unfortunately, in the past at least, one of the problems was that the diagnosis of why, for example, Southern Europe, the so-called pigs, that's what Goldman Sachs called them. I'm Italian, so I can say that. A German couldn't use that word. So Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, the reason their competitiveness was so much lower, if you want, than Germany's and some of the northern countries, the idea was that they were just spending too much. They needed to reduce their deficits. And so unfortunately, the conditions attached to some of the European bailout and other types of funds were often to cut public investment. And that's a real problem, because the real source actually of the difference in competitiveness is precisely that countries like Germany have invested in all sorts of things that countries like Italy, my own country, hasn't. If you think about the existence in Germany of a very active, strategic, well-structured public bank, the KfW, or very functional science industry linkages through the Fraunhofer Institutes or the Max Planck Institutes, or very well-funded vocational system so that workers' skills are invested in, that is not as strong. I would say it's extremely weak in Southern Europe. So what I think will really be a game changer, if this moment becomes one where we change the diagnosis, where we realize that we can't just have blanket policies of cutting deficits with these kind of voodoo numbers, like a 3% deficit. Anything above that is terrible. Anything below that is okay, as long as it approaches zero. And more about really understanding how we can build solidarity, not just in terms of philosophical solidarity, but also economic and structural solidarity, and learning between countries what works, what doesn't. And I think, this point that both Olaf and Annalena mentioned about the Hamiltonian moment, we need to be very careful, because the state is always present. It's always been present. The problem is what it does. And so, a country, again, like Italy, the state is present, but the problem is that the funds coming from the public sector have often been simply handouts. So lots of subsidies, lots of guarantees, not enough co-investment. And even in Germany, after the financial crisis, the kinds of bailouts that we saw were more about just kind of throwing money at particular areas like the car industry or infrastructure in the kind of most basic way, like roads. And I think what was really interesting in the recent recovery package in Germany announced on June 3rd was that it was much more ambitious than the previous recovery package. So it's not about the quantity of state, it's the quality, it's the ambition, it's the strategic drive to actually solve big problems. And the fact that the Green Deal policy right now, which really is shaping European policy in all sorts of different ways, also in terms of the structure of institutions like the European Investment Bank, kind of calling itself the climate bank, and the recovery packages in some countries, I repeat, in some countries, not all countries, having this kind of green ambition, I think is very encouraging. But I think personally, what I find will be game changing and really interesting is the more that these plans can go into the contracts, both in terms of new types of conditionalities for the bailouts. Globally, there's trillions, literally trillions of dollars or euros being thrown into the system to save us, to go back to normal. And the fact that actually it was the normal that got us into the crisis needs to be like a big headline point. But really, in France, for example, the bailouts to the airlines, to Air France itself, has been conditional on Air France reducing its carbon emissions. In Denmark, there's been talk about, actually, I think it's now become policy since 3 weeks ago, that the bailouts to companies will only be given to those that haven't used tax havens. Or in the US, Elizabeth Warren has been talking about the need to think about how the help to industry should be related to the governance structure of industry. So those companies that have excessively been using share buybacks need to rethink that. So instead of it being kind of this Davos jet set saying, oh, we need to rethink our purpose, we need to understand stakeholder, not shareholder value, really kind of walking the talk of purpose and share and stakeholder value now in COVID, both in terms of how we produce things like the vaccine. This race to the vaccine, that's not enough. We need to govern that process in such a way that really nurtures collective intelligence so that the patent system, the intellectual property rights don't kind of, mess things up along the way. But also the bailouts, again, being a real deal between public and private to kind of find solutions together. that mix this kind of short-term immediate need of providing cash to both families and to industry, but structured in a way that has an eye on the prize of the type of growth that we want, which must be inclusive growth, sustainable growth, and innovation-driven kind of smart growth. And that kind of smart Green New Deal needs to be embedded within the new structures, even in the short term. And I think that's the real challenge. Some countries are getting this right, and unfortunately, some countries aren't. And so I think the more we can get learning between European countries, instead of using this blanket word Europe, I think it'll help us.
Olaf, to come back to you, do you share Mariana's view, which is that there's a danger of us underestimating the structural shifts in the market that will need to take place if we're going to respond effectively to the climate emergency?
Yes, I do agree, but let me just say a short word to the debate we had before. I think there really is a change in the European strategy, and it is absolutely key that Germany is doing the job we are doing today. This is a very big country right in the center of the European Union. It has the biggest population and the biggest economic strength. And so it depends on what we are doing, whether we will have a more progressive strategy in Europe or we are moving into the other direction. And I really appreciate what Annalena said, saying that leadership is a question of courage. Yes, this is true. And you can understand that if you are a bit courageous, it really helps, because when we are saying we are doing this European strategy, we got the support of the people, and it was not, as anyone expected, that there was a lot of opposition and a strong majority of people saying that we couldn't do so. So I think there is also a basis in the public, in the democracy of our society, supporting such a strategy, and this is very promising for what we have to do in the future. My view is to say that it is not enough just to discuss about money. It is also necessary that we discuss about the needs for political changes, and if we are acting that much together, as we will do now when we are having all the necessary decisions in the end in the European Council and so on, I think it is absolutely key that we understand that this will have a price in political progress of cooperation and in decision-making processes, and for instance in fighting against tax havens that were mentioned, and minimum taxation. This is key. You cannot convince your people that they will support the idea of giving money to other countries if they are taxing their corporates lower than you do. So this is one question we should understand absolutely, and it is a part of all the things. Coming to your question, yes, I do agree that climate change is one of the main questions that has to be solved, and that all the decisions we are doing saving our economies now, which is in many cases just saving the companies and the jobs in a second, and in many days we are taking decisions 100, 200, 1,000 or so, and they are decided by a lot of people, and you cannot look at any case. But in the end, on the next thing we always have to implement in our strategies is to discuss about the future. And so developing the energy production with renewable energies is key for what we do. Developing the grid, which is key for renewable energies, is an important question. Discussing on hydrogen, which is the key industry for a CO2 neutral future of our societies, is an essential decision we have to do now, and not just as a project, as it was discussed in the time before. This has to be a process of industrialization, and I very much support what Mariana is writing and saying in our debate today, that the state has a key role for making such an industrialization process feasible. This will not be possible just by a decision of one or the other company. This is something which has too much to do with infrastructure decisions, which cannot be done just by a big company. This has to be done by the state, by the cooperation of the European Union. So it is absolutely necessary that we define what are the key decisions necessary for developing a climate neutral production, a CO2 neutral production for the future, and then do the necessary things and use the crisis now for making the progress. And then there are some other questions which have to be dealt, which we will not be able to discuss country by country, but I very much support the idea that there are some restraints that have to be understood. For instance, the legal system, which is important, the educational system, which is important, the vocational training, the universities, research, all the things which are important for a society, that it is able to create wealth with new methods, with skilled people, and all what you need for the success of a society.
Thank you. Annalena, one of the things I find fascinating about the Greens in Germany is that you're a much more mainstream party than the Green Party in many other political systems. Indeed, I brought over one of your colleagues to speak at an event in London with the deputy leader of our own British Green Party, which is tiny and only has one member of parliament. And one of the things about that kind of the mainstream nature of the Green movement in Germany is that whereas Greens in many other parts of the world are kind of anti-capitalist in their kind of perspective, you have worked in the Länder and federally worked quite happily with business in relation to the strategies we need for sustainability. So are you confident? I mean, one of the shifts between now and 2007-8, when that crisis, is that there does seem to have been a real shift in big business and in finance in terms of their understanding of the climate emergency and their willingness to act differently. So are you confident of the fact that, as it were, the business understands and gets this crisis, and that actually progressive governments can work with business to solve the problem?
Well, if they lead the process, I'm really convinced of that. It doesn't like fall down from sky of saying, here's the transformation we need, here is the carbon neutral society, here's the carbon neutral industry we need, and we cannot do it only by money. And I think now we're at the tricky point if we take billions in our hand. I mean, if we debated like last year, also within the German parliament, in the European parliament, about the question, okay, we need to invest into the future, we need to invest into a carbon neutral society. Everybody was saying, well, no, we don't have enough money to do this. Now we're at the moment where we take billions in our hand. And it's a question if we put it in the right direction to transform our industry, or if we don't. And I think it's very important what Mariana said. We have to look that we do not restore now our fossil past, but we have to build the road for a carbon neutral future. And then it's very much important that we have a governance structure for this process. And at this point, I'm at the moment not so trustful that we are there where we have to be yet. Because if we want to build this governance structure, which is already set up in the recovery plan for the European Union, where for the first time, governments are talking about carbon neutral Europe now, there's still the lack of the governance structure. For example, in Germany, the point which Mariana has said, unfortunately, Olaf, he sits next to me, so I'm looking to my right side, so you can see we are not so much in the middle. The conditionality is not there. Like in Germany, Lufthansa is saved or bailed out with 9 billion euros, and we didn't take the steps which is taken, and Mariana has mentioned, as in France, of saying, and here are the criteria, that we have less carbon dioxide in the aviation system. The same is for the big companies. Unfortunately, I proposed that a couple of times. We didn't have the conditionality that it's not only about not having money in tax havens country, but also that shareholders won't get any boni at this time because, for example, the car industry, if the owners of the companies would have said at this year or for the next year we don't take our boni, then they wouldn't have needed so much money and we could put it into a true transformation. We have another point, for example, the steel industry. They are struggling in Europe anyhow, even before Corona, and I think it's very important that we are not connecting everything with Corona now because we had some problems already before. So the steel industry, for example, 5 years ago they were fighting against the ETS, the European Trade Emission System. Then at some point they were recognizing it's not so much the CO2 price in Europe which pressures them, but it's the steel from China and too much steel on the globalized market. And at that point, they turned towards politics and were saying, so what can we do? And this is a tricky moment when industry stands at the point that the future is only in green technology. Then we have to take this chance. So at this moment, we have to tell the steel industry, we help you if you set up your steel production in a carbon neutral way, and we do that by guidelines. Unfortunately, yesterday or a couple of days ago, for the EU regulation of steel coming towards the European market, there was not this chance being taken of saying we want to go into carbon neutral steel, and also giving, like for car producers, a goal of saying in the future car we have to have a certain amount of green steel. So I think the very important point, to bring it down to the point, is that we connect all the investment, which is highly needed, with the strong regulation of CO2 emissions, with the strong regulation of overhead, for example, circular economy, which is very important next to carbon neutrality. And here again, if we don't have the trust of now building this green Europe, the chance will have passed and we are sliding into the next crisis, seeing it already in front of our eyes.
So, Mariana, I'm going to come to you in a moment. We're going to watch 4 very short videos in a second, but then I'm going to come to you, Mariana. There may be things in the videos that you want to comment on. They're from voices of people around the world who are participating in one way or another in our event. But then, Mariana, what I will also be interested in you is on your reflections on what Annalena has said in relation to the balance of kind of free trade and protectionism, and is the appropriate progressive position to say we're in favor of free trade, but it must be free trade underpinned by a set of standards in areas such as labor rights and, of course, as Annalena says, in relation to carbon emissions. So that's a question for you to ponder on. Not that you ever need any time to ponder on a question. You always have a ready answer. But let's watch these 4 videos before we continue the conversation.
Hello, my name is Mariana Baerbock and I am the co-editor-in-chief of Kurier Europejski, which is the Polish version of a multilingual web magazine affiliated to Jeff Europe. I am also helping Robert Biedroń with his presidential campaign here in France. My question regards the way the European Commission communicates on the efforts right now. Because here in France, for example, the government's narrative has been rather pro-European. President Macron has been mentioning the EU all along his televised addresses. Whereas in Poland, it was not the case. The government really presented the Next Generation EU plan as their own achievement, as their success in having negotiated such a good plan for the country. Such a phenomenon is worrying to the extent that such misleading informations are feeding Euroscepticism. So my question is how to cope with this matter, how to go beyond the pro-European bubble and really reach all EU citizens and inform them on common European efforts. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Diego Rivas and I am the chair of Democrats Abroad Berlin, the official representation of the Democratic Party for U.S. citizens living abroad. Our local chapter has 5,000 U.S. citizens. Across Germany, we are over 13,000. Also, I'm a Bernie Sanders delegate to the 2020 National Convention. In these volatile times and afterwards, we need policies that make a positive and direct impact in everyday people's lives. So, my question to the panel is, how can we as progressives better develop policy that materializes our values of tolerance, justice, and sustainability? Could you please then name one policy which is not yet implemented that you think would be able to enact this? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sophie Pornschlegel. I'm a senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center in Brussels, and my question concerns the approach taken by EU decision makers during this crisis. So we saw some advocate for a crisis response that really wants to go back to the future, so invest in agriculture, cohesion funds, and old industries rather than future-oriented policy fields, also with no conditionalities whatsoever on the rule of law or, for instance, climate. We also saw pro-European governments falling back into national reflexes with border closures. So that means that even progressives have struggled with this crisis response and fall back into old patterns rather than being courageous and looking into the future. So my question would be, how can we incentivize a really values-based and future-oriented crisis response even among progressives?
So we're living in a moment in which social tensions are going deeper and deeper. I personally have warned about the danger that populism poses for our democracies. I'm also worried, however, that I see an increasing tendency in many democracies for people who are broadly on what I would consider the right side, people who I sympathize with in a lot of their political positions, to write off anybody who has voted for populists, certainly to write off a large part of the population, saying these are just bad people, they're bigots, they're racists, they're sexist, and they're irredeemable. So I guess what I'm wondering about is how we can build a society in which we hopefully convince a lot of our compatriots, a lot of our fellow citizens not to vote for those political parties, in which we can hopefully have a politics in which sensible and less extreme voices prevail, but in which we bring our fellow citizens along, in which we don't write them off as terrible bigots whose death we have to await, but as people who might change their mind and come to join the common political fold. And so I guess I'm just wondering what you do in your daily political practice, how you think your political parties, your political movements can make sure that we actually persuade rather than just exclude and vilify. Thank you.
Hi, this is Luisa Neubauer. I'm a Fridays for Future activist from Germany. And together with the Fridays for Future movement across Europe, I am fighting for a just and sustainable future on a healthy planet. Nowadays, many people speak of the corona crisis as a chance, as an opportunity for the climate. And honestly, I don't share this perspective. We're not talking of an opportunity, we're talking of a clear responsibility to make sure that the treatment of the corona crisis doesn't fuel the climate crisis. And that includes clear investment strategies to prevent any money flowing into fossil fuel energies, which are destructing our future. So my question for you is, how do you make sure that this is not happening?
Well, those were fantastic contributions, I think. I'm not sure Yasha Monk, who was the third speaker, introduced himself, but that's who he was, speaking from Washington. So, Marianne, I promised I would come to you, and let's start with this question about free trade and protectionism and how and what the progressive position should be on that. But feel free to pick up in any of the points that you've heard from those brilliant contributions.
Okay, so I also wanted to comment actually on what was said before, as well as the contribution. So first of all, free trade is a false concept, right? I mean, any sort of trade, or also within nations, how markets themselves come about, is always heavily affected by rules, by norms, by institutions. And the word free market itself is this false word, right? Even Adam Smith, when he used the word, didn't actually mean free in the sense of how we talk about it today. He actually meant free from rent, free from value extraction in the economy. And if you read his work closely, it was definitely not free from the state. And I was curious, it was interesting what Annalena said, because my understanding in Germany about steel was actually that pre-COVID, the fact that there was actually a national strategy around the Energiewende to really have an economy-wide carbon reduction strategy meant that steel, unlike in the UK, where you and I live, Matthew, unlike in Belgium, unlike in some other countries, was forced actually to reduce its carbon content, its actual material content. And in order to do that, had to repurpose, recycle, and reuse. And as a consequence, the German steel industry is much more innovative than many other parts of steel, like in Italy, again, where I'm from, which just get these kind of bailouts. And that's pre-COVID. And what was interesting that Annalena said is perhaps that's no longer being done now in Germany. There's particular moments, again, in any country we can learn from. And it's not just about green. I mean, the questions that were asked, which I found fascinating as you did, had to do with values, so the value-based nature of our economy. It had to do with how do we bring citizens along and actually get citizens engaged so they're not just preached to, that notion of kind of co-creation. And the last question around how do you make sure this is real and not just kind of a bullshit moment? So let's, really embed it in how investment occurs and how we actually make sure that the fossil industry is reduced as a consequence of the crisis, as opposed to just money thrown at it. And I think the bigger question is, what do we even mean by values? So, green is really a vision of what kind of society we want to live in. Unfortunately, if we don't know how to communicate it, the left in many countries, progressives, given that this is a progressive governance conference, progressives have lost elections based on their inability to communicate a green strategy as a real opportunity for investment, an opportunity for creating new landscapes that could actually drive also business innovation and business behavior. So in Australia, I visited Australia 2.5 years ago. They were sure, the equivalent of the Labour Party there, were sure they were going to win the election. I was there in December. The election occurred in May and they lost. It was a huge upset. But it was because it was very much based on what we're talking about, a green, sustainable strategy that was very visionary. But the lack of ability to communicate what that actually meant for citizens, but also for workers who were in the dirtier kind of fossil industries, the lack of a credible just transition policy became a problem. And I think, the progressive agenda is a difficult agenda. It requires the same level of storytelling that unfortunately many regressive, not progressive parties have had. The Make America Great Again, that's a very simplistic story, but it doesn't mean that we can't have, in the progressive side, simple, not simplistic, easy to understand, but also really well communicated, which means a real engagement, not a preaching, but engagement with civil society. The kind of things, by the way, that the RSA, where you work, Matthew, I think have done really well, working with citizen assemblies, for example. This is the moment. And what COVID, I think, has presented us is lots of different problems, not just the ones around green growth and sustainability, but the digital divide, for example. I have 4 children. They're all home from school, and it's not great how the schools have sort of interacted with this moment, but it's good, and actually my children will be fine anyway. Many children are not being educated right now. The digital divide is massive, both because, lots of kids they not only don't have the technology at home, they don't have the money to pay for, the phone bills that are, being used if they're working with an iPhone or any sort of smartphone. And in London, this is in London, the digital divide is massive, let alone between countries and developing countries. So look at the digital divide. Look at the loneliness of the elderly or people alone at home during the lockdown. Look at the need that we actually require to really produce en masse personal protective equipment, which still in the UK is not being produced. These are all problems that society faces, and how to kind of construct a outcomes orientation to our economy, a problem-based way in which we actually bring public and private together to solve the digital divide, to solve the green growth problems, but also the loneliness problem. Some countries actually have ministers of loneliness today. This is, I think, the COVID moment. And because governments have the upper hand right now, because they do, they're injecting huge amounts of liquidity into the system. This is the moment to learn the lesson of the financial crisis, where, again, trillions were injected in, but most of that money ended up back into the financial sector. How to create structures in the real economy that absorb these funds, but it's not just the infrastructure or industries that absorb it. It's new forms of collaboration between civil society, between business and government, solving these critical problems together, from the green problems to the digital divide. This is what we need to get right. We haven't gotten this right so far. And the myth, even, I mean, Olaf, if I can just pick one little, not fight with you, but little debate point, we need to go away from talking about SMEs, small, medium enterprises, as a thing in and of themselves, or sectors, or even renewable energy. This is about getting all sectors to work together in a different way. Firms of different sizes, small, medium, and large, obviously they will require different types of support, but it's not about supporting SMEs. It really is about picking the willing. Where are the companies that are willing to engage with governments around these critical social problems? And if those companies are small, they will need extra support because they're small. But we shouldn't just for kind of political reasons talk about SMEs. We need to move to really say there's huge societal challenges, the climate one being the biggest one we have, but actually it's a symptom of an underlying structural problem that we have in capitalism. We're producing in problematic ways, we're distributing in problematic ways, and we're consuming in problematic ways. And finding these new kinds of contracts and turning this into an investment strategy, as that last question asked us to, requires unpicking the current kind of value chain in business, but also the way that public and private interact. And in terms of free trade, Matthew, I mean, it's always been false, right? I mean, Germany has never had free trade. Italy has never had free trade. The US has never had free trade. The US has always talked like Jefferson, but acted like Hamilton. That's sort of the thesis of my book, The Entrepreneurial State. But we now need everyone to talk like Hamilton and to have real learnings between what works, what doesn't. And the difference between Vietnam, Kerala during this crisis, and many other countries that just haven't had that state capacity to govern the crisis as well as both Vietnam and Kerala did. In the developing world, that should be a wake-up call that we need to build state capacity, dynamic capabilities within states, which unfortunately have to a large extent been outsourced to the private sector. And it's not about private or public, but both private and public really governing themselves ambitiously and having capacity within and between.
So, Olaf, I want to ask you, I mean, I'm sure you want to respond to what Mariana said, although we don't have that much time left, but I also want to ask you as a politician, you know, the Progressive Governance Summit was established at a time when, you know, with Tony Blair and Gerhard Schroeder and Bill Clinton, where it looked as though the progressives were astride the world, you know, the progressive politicians were in power in so many places. And of course, you know, things have changed. Many people thought after the global financial crisis that we would move into a more progressive era. But in fact, what we've seen is the rise of populism. So as well as kind of responding to anything that Mariana said or that was in the films that you want to respond to, could you just give us a sense of how you think politically progressives need to fight back? Because, you know, the populists are not going to go away, and they're pretty good at what they do. And indeed, it isn't really just populists. That there is an alternative model to democracy, and that alternative model to democracy, it's easy to caricature it, and you see places like Brazil where it's falling apart, or Trump is a joke. But, you know, China is a much more difficult case in terms of, you know, what's happening there. So how do progressives win the argument that we are the best force to sustain liberal democracy right now?
We should be very clear. If we look at all the different rich countries where we live in mostly, and especially in Europe, if we look at Scandinavia, if we look at the Netherlands, if we look at Germany, Austria, for instance, just to name a few, we see that though from a global perspective, these are very rich countries, very wealthy, where many people would like to live. It's also that a lot of people are losing confidence about the future. And I think this is the big problem which produces the Brexit, or it's produced Trump. And we could continue with explaining all the outcomes of the same situation of this 21st century, which is that in our countries, a lot of people are not that sure that they will have a good future, they or someone like them. And so I think the first thing we have to re-establish for fighting back all ways of right populism, for instance, is that we create a culture of respect and solidarity. It is not the right way to say that there is a difference. between those who have academic skills and those who are doing a job after vocational training. And if we are not giving the idea that it is our case that someone who has possibly an unskilled job and just working in a shop doing something with filling up packages into the shop, that he is part of our political strategy and that we work very hard that he has a good and proper life and good pensions, for instance, we will not succeed. So it is a question which is a combination of respect, a combination of solidarity and a strong social welfare state, but also, and this is the connection to all the other questions we have to tackle with, is that we are able to win the future. So if someone is not believing that the way we are acting will give a chance that in 10 or 15 or 20 years, someone like him or himself will have a good and proper life, they will look for someone else to support him. So it is not just social welfare system, it's also this question. And there I think the progressives have a good chance to combine all the different questions of industrialization, of economic future, of good and proper jobs from in all the aspects of jobs, not just in the high-ranked jobs, and climate change, for instance, and digitalization. If we can give the people the idea that they could have a chance in this new world, they would be more willing to be part of it. So, for instance, taking the question of steel industry, yes, that is true. Compared with other countries, they made quite a good job in reducing CO2 emissions. Compared to what is possible, they did not reach all the possibilities which one could have done. So part of the package we decided in the German government on our recovery fund is, for instance, the aspect of hydrogen, because we know the steel industry, the car industry will just be successful with steel production and use of steel if this will be done not with fossils and with coal, for instance, but with hydrogen. And this must be green hydrogen, it must be coming from renewables, it's absolutely clear. And this is a many billion package which we decided on for the next decade, and I think this is the question of transformation. It's also the case with the digitalization. If you are a trucker and happy with the job you have, and you read in the newspaper that there is something like autonomous driving coming up, you might be not that happy about the future. So if we can make it give an idea how this development can also implement a good and proper life for those who are afraid about the possible outcomes of technological progress, we will be successful. If we do not manage this, we will be not successful, because then someone is looking to the past. My view on progressive policies is always that we are believing that the future could be better than the past if we do the right things. If we are just one of the political movements looking back to the past and saying the past was better than the days we are living in, we will lose the contact of the people. So we must be always aligned with progress. And I think this is the main question to be answered. And if this could be the common strategy of the different camps of the progressive parties in Europe, I think we could together be as strong, possibly differently assembled as in 40 years ago, but we could be strong and lead countries, and in also developing a European political strategy, changing a bit the world, because it is Europe that is essential for a multilateral perspective, also in trade questions, as they were mentioned by Mariana and by all those who gave their statements. And we have a very important task to develop something which is not just a new way of protectionism with a good flag, but it must be something which is really helping in the ways of how production is done in the world, in the ways how we reduce climate emissions all over the world and make this feasible for all the people. And so I think all this together will be important. And just to say the last sentence, we should be optimistic that we have a chance. And it is not that the things are necessarily going into the wrong direction. And it is not what anyone is writing in the newspapers today, that there is a new two powers world with China and the USA coming for the future. The future world will be completely different as the leaders in those two countries might think. There is also India, there is Indonesia, there is Japan, there is Korea, there is Brazil, possibly another Brazil as today. There is the United States, yes, there is Russia, there is Europe. And this is a world which will be not led by one country. But if we, as at this point, strongest economy of the world, the European Union, are working together and are developing a progressive strategy, we could make a difference.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the last word to you, Annalena, because we have 3 minutes left to go. And could you just give us some advice? I mean, the Greens in Germany have done so well. You have grown, you've gone into coalitions, and you've not lost any popularity. You are talking about the biggest threat facing the planet, but yet you are optimistic. What is it that the Greens have done right? And what is it that those on the social democratic left can learn from you in terms of your political strategy, which seems to me to be principled, but yet inclusive?
Well, we are still in opposition, so I think I'm not the best person to give
maybe that's the secret to
everybody.
It, yeah.
Well, I think we are 40 years old now, the same age than I have. My party here in Germany, and there were some times where people looked at us and were saying, well, you're so value-based and you will never go forward with these values. I think in the last years, it has shown that in crisis, it's very good to have a clear compass where you want to go and where you're starting from. But if we're in politics, we have to change things on a daily basis. So you have to connect your values with pragmatic steps. And I think this is really important, that you show progress is possible and you can change something in the world when you do politics. And the important thing is that we do not go into like a niche, neither as Greens nor as progressives, of saying we are representing this certain amount of the population and we do not care for the rest. I mean, politics is looking at the society as a whole and saying if we want to do the green transition, we cannot only look at climate activists, at ourselves as renewable energy, but we have to find also an answer of those people working in coal mines and saying, okay, here are the jobs of your future. And approaching also these workers in this field is, in my belief, the important point of bringing like our market economy from the 20th century, where we said we want to build a social market economy. This was a big success of the Social Democrats, of bringing the social aspect into our economy. And now is the time of connecting social and ecological movements together, of forming a transformative social ecological market economy. And this is a big job to do, but I think we can do it if we connect different movements in society, if we work with trade unions together and climate activists, and also show people, and this is a moment of hope, which we have also learned, I think everybody in Europe from Obama, saying if we form the future, it's also a chance for everybody. And coming back to the starting point, maybe if I have the last word now, for all the recovery plans, saying that all the money we take in our hand is a big change. And Europe has developed a good standard for the green investment, the taxonomy, where we have 6 environmental goals of saying if you invest, sustainable into the future, you have to fulfill one of the 6 criteria. And I think this principle of taxonomy has to be the principle also for future legislation, for future decision making, of showing that we can build together this future sustainable, and looking at everybody working for it. And
well, thank you. It's great to end on a tone which is both optimistic and very concrete. So thank you, Annalena. Thank you, Olaf. Thank you, Mariana. As I said at the beginning, this event is advertised as the grand finale, but actually I'm doing a keynote speech tomorrow lunchtime. So it may be that I'm speaking. It may be that I'm speaking to an empty room, who knows? But in case the conference is going on tomorrow and I am doing keynote, do come in and you can hear that I have ideas as well as being able to chair events. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow.